It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Bass Distinguished Lecture. My name is David Skelly. I'm director of the Peabody Museum. And for those of our members of the Leadership Council here, we've just gotten done with a really great meeting today. And this is a segue traditionally to a great meeting to come tomorrow for the External Advisory Board of the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies. It's my pleasure today to introduce Jessica Thompson. Jessica is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and also a curator in anthropology, in the anthropology division of the Yale Peabody Museum. Jessica is a broadly trained paleoanthropologist who studies how our ancestors engineered their own evolution through shifts in subsistence, tool use, and social cooperation. She completed her PhD in human evolution and social change at Arizona State in 2008. And after obtaining an MPhil at the University of Cambridge in 2002, she got a, well, sorry, I'm trying to ad lib something that I didn't write. So let me back up and say she completed her BS at the University of New Mexico in 2000, and then an MPhil at the University of Cambridge in 2002. Before coming to Yale in 2019, she was assistant professor of anthropology at Emory University after completing 2 postdoctoral appointments at the University of Queensland in Australia. And we have to talk about this because I have done sabbatical leave at University of Queensland. Jessica's research has emphasized 2 time periods of extraordinary biobehavioral change. First, the emergence and dispersal of our species Homo sapiens within the last 300,000 years. And second, the transition of our ancestors into a more carnivorous dietary niche around 3 million years ago. She has published 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, 9 peer-reviewed book chapters, and 10 other publications such as commentaries and op-eds. So Professor Thompson is the PI of the Malawi Ancient Lifeways and Peoples Project, recently funded by the National Science Foundation. This project connects ancient hunter-gatherer behavior to paleo environments in southern Central Africa. As someone who has done fieldwork in 8 countries and taken more than 100 students to Malawi, she thinks critically about the process of field data production, power dynamics, and aims to make fieldwork more inclusive to all. She's active in public liaison and eager to bring the excitement of paleoanthropological research to life. She's seen her work appear in multiple news outlets and as the cover story on Yale News multiple times. And what I will say that isn't in here is that Jess arrived at Yale and approximately 4 minutes later got really involved in the development of some of our key exhibits and one gallery in particular, and instantly became instrumental in developing a really exciting space that we're getting ready to share with you next year. She impressed everyone at the Peabody with, especially for somebody who was brand new to our institution, her understanding and sensitivity to all the different dynamics that go into creating a wonderful exhibition. And with that, let's welcome Jess.
One of the main reasons that I came to Yale was because when the opportunity did arise, I pondered it long and hard, but the Peabody was really that was the magic bullet, because it is such an amazing institution, and I've kind of been around and within museums for most of my career, and they just feel like really important spaces to be in. And to be kind of the ability to be able to work with that has been really as beneficial to me, if not more than what you just described in the other way. So that's been a great opportunity. And also just thanks for coming and listening to me talk today. Today I get to talk about my favorite topic, which is myself, and, well, more specifically, my research. So this is something that I'm happy to answer any additional questions about. If you want to catch me afterwards, I have plenty of stories to tell, and that's kind of what I hope to do today, is actually tell a story. It's in the title, so I'm committed to it. And what I'm also going to kind of convey, I hope, is the fact that I really do live a fairy tale sort of life. I get to do things in my career on a day-to-day basis where I learn something new, usually many things new, every single day. And it's usually something random, and it's usually something I find fascinating. So to be able to actually do that as a job is really a fairy tale come true. And so I hope as I kind of take you along on this journey, you'll see some of the ways that I've been inspired as I've gone. So we start the story here. We have to have a setting and a location. As you can see, it's a beautiful one. This is just one of those rare moments. I was out doing field work, and I turned around, and this was spread out before me. And I had a terrible camera in my hand, but I took the picture anyway, and it turned out all right. But this is kind of the magic of doing field work, is you never know when you're just going to do that thing where you turn around and suddenly you think to yourself, this is my office. This is actually where I get to go work. And what we'll do is we'll populate this story with some characters. And this is J. Desmond Clark, who is fairly well known in circles with people who know about kind of archaeology and paleoanthropology, but a little bit less further afield. But Louis Leakey is a name that a lot of people do know outside even of those circles. So here's a photo of them together. I honestly can't remember where I got this photo from, but it's showed up in a number of my talks, and I love it because it just looks like they're having a really important conversation about something. And who knows? I mean, it could have been what they had for breakfast. But J. Desmond Clark was my advisor's advisor, so I'm technically his academic granddaughter, but I never had a chance to meet him because he passed away in 2002. And at the same time, we're going to kind of follow the thread of his journey as we see it entwined with some of the, the threads that I picked up. And one of the things that happens is actually when I try to explain this to people, this is a photo in Malawi, which is where my field site is, and they think I'm his actual granddaughter most of the time, which is not true, but okay. And he has this quote in an article that he wrote, said, Nyasaland, which is the former colonial name for Malawi, has long been the Cinderella of Central African prehistory. And I had actually no idea what that meant when I first read it. I thought it was very silly. But as I've kind of started to work there more, I've realized what he's talking about is, this is this precious, beautiful gem of a place that is just kind of misunderstood. People don't see it for really what it is and what it has to offer. So I'm going to take you through there and hopefully convince you that that's the case. So here we have another quote by Clark. And as you can see, back in 1955, he was already saying, well, it's practically, we don't know that much about this place. And yet, it is still potentially really important. And what I want to kind of demonstrate to you is we still actually don't know that much more than he did in 1955 and what kind of a travesty that is. So I personally, by the way, I don't own a fedora, but, or the dress, although my husband owns a fedora, not the dress. Right, so another quote, admittedly, a more optimistic one. These blanks are slowly being filled. They will eventually disappear. What an optimist, right? We know that in science that never actually happens. You never stop finding out what you want to know, or at least having the curiosity. But I'll introduce you to Malawi. So this is a very colorful rendition of it. I've grayed out everything that's not Malawi, and then I've kind of made some topography in there. So you can see that there's a bunch of highlands, which are the yellow things, and then there's, the other way around. The lowlands, no, I'm right. The highlands are yellow, the lowlands are kind of brown. And then there's this big lake, and the lake is beautiful, and I'll show you a picture of that. And that's divided into 3 administrative regions. And what I want to show you here is if you take all of the numeric dates at the time that I kind of started getting really interested and invested in doing work there, that had ever been produced for any archaeological site in the entire country, there were these, and I think there's 26 of them. So when we're talking about kind of a blank spot on the map in terms of information that we don't have, Clark was not too far off in 1955, and in 2011 we were in a similar sort of position. So why would this be? Well, it turns out that there just hasn't been that much work that's been done there. And there are people who would love to see this work done there, but there's kind of an infrastructure issue. And so the legacy of trying to build out research, unfortunately, often falls to better resourced places taking an interest in it, and then being able to develop collaborations with folks on the ground. And I've been very privileged to be able to do that. So in 2011, these were pretty much the only places that had ever been dated, the only archaeological sites in the whole country that had any dates for them. And they're gray. These funny little distribution things are, I hope I don't do something weird. Okay, that's a pointer. So this is just like the error of each individual age. And then these are the actual, like, thousands of years ago units there. And what I'll show you is that all the numeric dates from the Stone Ages of Malawi now, as of today, and I was really hoping that I would have more to show you, but when I emailed the guy who's doing the dating for us, he said, no, not yet. But there will be more, and we'll have more than 100, meaning that we can actually start to get a handle on when things happened in the past, which is probably one of the more important things you could know about the past, right? And you can see that we have all our radiocarbon ages. The red ones are the ones we've contributed to the record. And then the OSL ages, so this is a different dating method that can go back further in time, are on the bottom. So we've produced a lot of data, in other words. And then there's this question of, well, why would you produce data? What's the importance of it? And why do we care? Well, this is interesting to a lot of people. We also have the best ancient DNA record of hunter-gatherers anywhere in Africa in this tiny country. And that's been because of, you know, these collaborations that we've been able to build, as well as this remarkable record that we have. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done. So I'll get back to that at the end. If you're asking why this matters, is because I want to emphasize these blanks are slowly, this is that quote again, slowly part of it, being filled. But they are being filled. And the reason we would like to see it is, oh no, my little mountain reedbuck thing is up there. I was hoping it wouldn't do that. Look at that. Anyway, what you're seeing here is the Zambezian biome. So this is this kind of forest belt that sits across the middle part of Africa. And all of the little dots represent some archaeological site that dates to the ice ages at some point in time, somewhere in Africa, where you've got both artifacts made by humans or human ancestors together in the same hole with like some kind of actual faunal record. So the bones of animals. And that, as you can see, is not as common as you would expect for a place as large as Africa. This is all of them. We just did this comprehensive lit review, and this is every single one of them. So apart from that, you can also see that there are very few in this area. So we don't know a lot about what people, or even earlier human ancestors, were actually doing in this part of Africa. This matters as well, because if you look at, like, this is where Malawi is, if you look at the distribution of some other species, like let's take the mountain reedbuck, which is sort of a, it's an antelope that's about this high, it likes to live near water. They, as you can see, live in a couple different parts of Africa, and they don't live in the middle part there. So what we're looking at here is the legacy of some past fragmentation, right? These populations had to be connected at some point. So the question is, this is not good habitat for them, so why aren't they there? And then how did they get to be in these two places? And so we start to think, well, maybe this is a really important place biogeographically, because you have the separation of populations today. That doesn't mean they were separated in the past. What if the same processes were playing out with people, or even earlier? So I'll tell you the story in sort of 3 chapters, and then there has to be a moral at the end. So we'll do the not so deep dark woods, a path of breadcrumbs, and then the ostrich that laid the golden egg. And you can ponder what each of those will mean. But chapter 1, the not so deep dark woods, is a reference to the fact that we're dealing with like an open woodland here. This is not a deep dark woods. This is a place where you can walk between trees and the canopy usually doesn't touch. That doesn't mean it's not hard to walk around and there aren't snakes everywhere, because there's a lot of bush. But when you're kind of navigating around through this landscape, it really doesn't feel anything like you're in a jungle, or like you're in the open sort of savanna ecosystems that you might think of as the iconic places where humans evolved. And so thinking about what this actually represents is that this is a highly seasonal environment too. So no one kind of picture actually does it justice. You've got a lot of variability in a pretty concentrated place. So again, here we are in this sort of teal area here, and there's our study area. This is the Zambezian open forest. And so that is, again, dividing these two parts of Africa that are better known. And then in the wet season, these grasslands, they sort of flood out. And they form these almost rivers of grass that go between and around and fill in the valleys that are between these heavily wooded outcrops. And what that means is that you have a huge diversity of animals that live all across this landscape, and they're always moving around. And anyone who was living there in the past was going to have to deal with a seasonality that was changing all the time, right? So the resources they could get on a given day were not guaranteed to be the same ones that they could look at the next time. This matters because here's where modern hunter-gatherer groups that we can actually go and talk to and ask them, why are you doing that? What kind of food are you eating? How do you prepare it? They live in these places in Africa today, which means that we don't have a direct way of understanding how it is that anybody could survive in the Zambezian open forest. There's actually even a book written by a French person called How to Live and Survive in the Zambezian Open Forest, which is a wonderful book. But that's because people who live there today still do kind of supplement their maize and so on with wild resource, but nobody actually lives as a hunter-gatherer anymore. And that makes archaeology super important because that's the only way we can get at that. And again, if you're wondering, well, why do I care? It's because people also would have been moving back and forth through this area as they were dispersing throughout Africa. So if you want to put the origins of our species, modern humans, down here, like some people do, then they had to get up there to get out of Africa, right? They had to go through there. And the same thing, we know we have this incredible record of really early art, for example, on the southern coast of Africa. How did they get down there? And that makes this particular part of the continent quite interesting. So I'll show you just some of the variation that we see. Just going over 40 kilometers, what is that in miles? I guess that's like 30 miles, right? 25 miles, something like that. It's short. You can actually go from this habitat at 2,500 meters above sea level to this. So it's an enormously variable landscape, and you can traverse it pretty quickly. So if you're a hunter-gatherer, you've got lots of pockets that you can poke around in, lots of different resources you can try to take advantage of. And then in the middle, you have this lovely open canopy forest. And this photo was taken actually in the wet season, which is right now. So this is what it will look like right now. If anybody has seen in the news hurricane, or I should say cyclone Freddie, that was impacting not necessarily my study area, but people very close to it, because there's a really big monsoon that goes through there every year. Right, so this is what we think of if you want to hunt for fossils. We want to go back in time. We want to know what the animals were like when they lived there. This is a fossil hunter's dream. Note, this is not in Malawi. This is not even close to Malawi. So why am I putting this here? It's to show you what we don't have, which is these big open exposures where fossils are just kind of pouring out of the hill slopes. And these are ancient kind of riverbeds and so on. What we have in Malawi is we have this. So this is different. This is a lot harder to look for fossils. You can see that the visibility is almost zero. I cheated a little bit, and I took this in the wet season, but in the dry season, it's also kind of like this. And then you also have, geologically, a fairly young part of the rift system. So the Great African Rift ends in Malawi. It's the southern terminus. And so you've got all these like pebbles and things which were in the riverbeds that were rushing across, this quickly forming rift. And that forms a cap on top of all the loose sediments that contain the fossils. So the fossils just sit there, and they don't erode out, and it's very hard to find them. And this is very discouraging for people who want to go looking for them, and they kind of want an easy day out. So it is not an easy place to work, but it is a good place to work, I should say, a productive place. This is not my work, but I'm kind of edging this way towards becoming involved in these older deposits. In the 80s and 90s, there were some German colleagues of mine, and then also some folks from NYU who were interested in that biogeographic problem. And they said, maybe we can find some early hominins there. So these are human ancestors. And in fact, they actually did. They found Paranthropus, which is this weird sort of cousin, I suppose, to Homo, to our genus. It's not an ancestor, but it is also part of the human story when you go back in time and you look at the sort of paleoanthropology. And then they actually have also got, believe it or not, this is a beautiful specimen of early Homo. So this is a mandible from someone who could have actually been your like great, whatever, right? Because this is a member of our genus Homo, and we don't actually know anything about its ecology in this particular part of Africa because people don't actually do much work here. And the reason that we think this is particularly interesting is because there have been some folks that have sampled this mandible to look and see what it's eating. So like what you eat gets incorporated into the chemistry of your teeth, and then you can analyze that. And when you do that, you can get a sense of if they're getting most of their dietary sustenance from open habitats or from closed habitats. And in this case, you're seeing that the folks in the more traditional places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, those, the places where Louis Leakey was working, those hominins are living in much more open habitats. And a lot of the story, you might have even heard about like the emergence of humanity was we like walked out of the jungle right out into the savanna and we saw the light and we had to rise above the, the grass. These are all these sort of narratives that make their way out into the public about the emergence of humans. And it's actually not entirely clear that we did have the origins of Homo in a savanna ecosystem, open grasslands, because you also have now this one from Malawi that's showing very much that it lived in closed habitat. And so if you were Desmond Clark and you were arguing with Louis Leakey, I could imagine him saying something like this. I won't attempt to mutilate the British accent, but I can feel it, right? I can hear this conversation taking place. Maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe we have lots of exciting hominins up in the upper part of the Rift Valley, but they're not the ones that are as interesting to the story of our emergence. And maybe we just don't know because we haven't done enough work in this part of Africa to be able to test that. It's an intriguing proposition, I think. The other thing, if we go back to another Clark quote, is that they looked for stone artifacts, apparently diligently, diligent search, and didn't find any associated with it. So it's kind of like, you have the emergence of the genus Homo. It's supposed to be making stone tools. That's what it does. That was like, if you've heard of Homo habilis, that's the handyman. It's named the handyman because it's supposed to be handy. It's supposed to be a tool maker. And so there was no stone tools associated with this mandible, which was kind of a mystery to people. However, when I went there last year, there's stone tools everywhere. What it was they just didn't have, they weren't looking for them because you had people who were looking for specific kinds of fossils and then the archaeologists were working like in a different place and there wasn't communication in the group. Somebody actually needs to go back there and check that out. So if you didn't believe that that was actually a stone tool, maybe this will convince you. These are really stone tools. Like, I mean, okay, admittedly that looks a little, but I know it's a stone tool. There is others. That I think nobody can dispute is definitely a stone tool. This is what we call a hand axe. And it dates to a later time period that has never been reported from this part of Africa. It is kind of amazing that it hasn't been. We expect it to be there. But the deposits that date to the right time period have never really been reported. And again, that's just lack of research effort. That's not necessarily because they're not there, because there I am holding it. There are also fossil bones associated with it, so we can get a sense of the environment. And there are these weird things. These are stromatolites. So these are like these vegetal mats that grow in lakes. And one of the reasons that folks have been slow to work here is not only is it hard to find fossils, but it's really hard to date these deposits. And remember, if you go back to the beginning, like the timing is kind of everything. And broadly, we don't really know how old these deposits are. I mean, at its grossest sense, we know they're somewhere between like 4 million and about 500,000 years old. And you can kind of put it into a basic order, but the actual numerical ages are not there. And that's because the materials you can date are not there the way they are like in Ethiopia, where you have these nice big volcanoes, they spit out a bunch of ash and you can date the ash. We don't have any of that, which means we need to be creative. So I'm gonna try to date that thing. Apparently it can be done. So we're working on it. Here's another quote for you. And I just want to say, look, I mean, there's 4 million years of very rare paleoanthropological discoveries just waiting to be made. This quote was by me just now when I said it. All right. So that's kind of setting the scene for going all the way back, right? Back to our origins. This is a really intriguing place. Now, most of my work has been on later time periods here. So let's look at how that got started. And I'll kind of put myself into the story with my own black and white photo that looks probably older than it is. And I've got a look on my face that says either it's very cold up here, or tell me that I can't do it again, because that's how I'm gonna go do it. Someone told me I couldn't do it. And that's why I work in Malawi now. I thought it was a great idea. I went traveling through there. It was a road trip. You can see here. Right, that was my road trip. And on the way back, on the way down, we just like passed through Malawi. And I thought, this is cool. And we went up to this national park, super high elevation. Remember those high elevation grasslands that I showed you at the beginning? Extremely cold. And I was kind of wandering around and I was finding stone artifacts because I had my archaeology eyes on. I was there as a tourist, but I was seeing them everywhere and I was thinking, I wonder what's been written about this. And it turns out that actually there is a site there that was a burial ground for hunter-gatherers. And it's way, over somewhere back there and down the hill and through some ravines. So we looked for it. And the roads are not kind. So we looked, and then we all had a big fight with each other about like how we were getting lost and no one knew where they were going and we were definitely not gonna find this site. So we turned around and we never found it. We never actually went there. And so maybe that was what I was thinking in this photo. But there's a happy ending to that story, which I'll show you in a minute. We'll get to it, but just hold that thought. We never found that site that time. What I did was I went back to South Africa, which is where I was based at the time. I was supposed to be finishing a PhD, but I was like, on to the next thing. I said, this sounds cool. I'm gonna go to Malawi and I'm gonna check this out. And I looked at the literature, and as you can see, speaking of blanks on the map, there's like nothing there. Literally not a single site in Malawi is on this map. Okay, so this map is from the year 2000, fair enough. It was just updated a couple of weeks ago. There's a brand new review that just came out. Nothing has changed. It's still not on there. The reason is because this hasn't been, well, I think there might be one, and it might be one that actually we excavated, but the map was kind of sideways and hard to read. Anyway, this area was not represented at all on the map because it's not an area that has a lot of information, and it was about the origins of modern humans. So this is not the genus Homo anymore. This is us. This is Homo sapiens, the very first humans to have ever emerged and lived and done their creative business and expanded around the globe and potentially killed off a bunch of megafauna. We don't know, it's controversial. But humans have had a pretty big impact on this planet. We can all agree with that. So when and how did it all start? That's what I was studying from the perspective of someone who was working down here. And then I had become intrigued with this area, so I looked into it. And there wasn't a lot that had been published, but there were sites there. And guess who had excavated them? Right, it was Desmond Clark. So I kept looking into it, and I discovered that there was a group of people who had just put some big drill, like basically a giant oil rig that they've adapted to a lake, and they drilled down into the lake to pull out these paleo-environmental records. You can get all the pollen and stuff that flies around. It ends up at the bottom of the lake, and then you can reconstruct the vegetation that used to be there. So I thought, okay, well that's promising because I don't have to now try to apply for some huge grant that I would have no business actually being able to conduct. I can just go there and work on those sites, and I can actually use the data that other people have, who are actual lacustrine geologists have extracted. So that's what we did. We teamed up, and I started thinking, well, what happens? If you're there, so we're now in northern Malawi, and here's your river catchment coming down, and you're there, and you're a hunter-gatherer, and you're living along the shoreline, and your lake is there, what happens when there's a hyper-arid period? Because that's what those lake core the drill cores were starting to show, was there were just these periods of time when the lake did this, like basically just vanished. My scale bar is off the map, but this is about 50 kilometers. So this is not a lake that's even visible anymore. You're there, and a couple of generations later, the lake is further away, it's further away, it's further away. They called these mega drought periods, but they were very long, like tens of thousands of years long, hyper-arid periods, when probably if you were a hunter-gatherer living there, you would have just left, right? Because there wasn't going to be much there for you. And so I started this project called the Malawi Earlier Middle Stone Age Project because that was the types of sites there were supposed to be of the same time period that I was already working on in South Africa, the Middle Stone Age, that period of emergence of modern humans. And what we found was a lot of dirt and a lot of rocks, but every one of these things is a stone artifact that you see popping out. So you don't have to dig very far, and it's amazing. There's this whole landscape, it's all red, it is really that red, and you dig a hole, and there's a bunch of artifacts down there. It's guaranteed, it's not risky. Any hole you dig, you will find them. And the cool thing about it is when you find them, they often fit back together again. Like the person who made them broke them, however long ago, tens of thousands of years ago, dropped them there, walked away, and then you're the next person to pick them up. It's really, really cool feeling. And how they got there is kind of a mystery. Not so much anymore, but we did a lot of digging. We put a lot of holes in the ground. That's me back there. I don't just stand there and supervise. I do it. And we had a lot of like field schools and that. So this is a bunch of field school students we had from the University of Queensland. There's my son, who is now 15 and going back to Malawi again, and he's unhappy about it, but he'll have to enjoy it. And then we found a lot of stone artifacts. So this is what people were doing in the Middle Stone Ages. They were making stone tools like this, and then they were using them for their daily tasks. What you'll notice is missing from this picture, though, is bones, right? So I study fossils. I'm interested in fossils. There's no fossils. The preservation is not good for fossils. So that was discouraging and frustrating, but we did learn something else. So I want you to not switch off when you see the busyness here, because I'm going to take you through it. First of all, this is like the big kind of finding. This red bar represents the period of time that we ended up dating all those sites to. So we were the first to actually date the sites that Desmond Clark had found in the 70s. And what we found was that they all date to the last 100,000 years, every single one of them, all in that red dirt. We were expecting it to date more like the last 300,000 years, maybe beyond, because that's how old the Middle Stone Age is elsewhere in Africa. So we were like, I was kind of sad, actually. I was pretty annoyed because I wanted it to be old. That's why it's called the Earlier Middle Stone Age Project, because it's supposed to be the early part of the Middle Stone Age, and in fact, most of it wasn't. And I was talking to the people who had done the paleoenvironmental cores, and they said, hang on a minute. The most interesting part of the entire 1.3 million years that we have represented in those cores is the last 100,000. And I was like, why? And they said, here it is. So we're just showing you the last 600,000 years here. They said, look, what happens is, you go backwards, there's these two hyper-arid periods that I've mentioned before, right? This is lake level. So it's high, it's low, it's high, it's low, high, it's low. And then there's these two like unusually low, fairly brief in the grand scheme of things, but still many, thousands of years long, hyper-arid periods. And during those hyper-arid periods, you have accelerated erosion. So this is the erosion, right? It's not very, stuff isn't eroding into the lake very quickly, and then as soon as you get this arid period, it starts to erode like crazy. Didn't seem like that happened previously. When you had an arid period, you don't see that same spike. So something weird going on. They said also, you've got these kind of charcoal dumps into the lake. It's just a huge amount of charcoal starts pushing into the lake, and it's not apparent that that was happening before. You can really see the scale of them here, I hope. Big, big chunks of charcoal, big, I should say not chunks of charcoal, but just lots and lots and lots and lots of it moving into the lake. And also, at the same time, you see this pink line. This is really important. This is species richness. So the number of species of plant that were around and represented in the pollen is high, it's low, it's high, it's low. And when you live in an environment that has a lot of like forests, you have more diversity often. And so this tracks forest cover coming and going and coming and going and coming and going. And then what happens here? Can you all see how unusual that is? That's a really weirdly flat line that we don't have anything like it in the last 600,000 years. There's something different. And almost all of the species richness that used to come back when you would have lake levels rise again doesn't return, right? So you would have this kind of correlation where the lake is high, you get more species richness because you have more forests. The forests expand, they have more species, and it all would track very nicely as you would expect. But in the last 100,000 years, something weird happens, and it just tanks. So the species richness is no longer following or tracking the expected pattern based on just climate. So that's what we're seeing there. And then there's this increase in fire-tolerant taxa, so that makes sense because you've got more charcoal. And then here's the grand finale. Your grasslands permanently spread out. So although it's an open forest now, with these kind of rivers of grass between them, there was a lot more forest there in the past. And that's revealed by the pollen. So what happened is, we think you had a situation where in the natural condition, you've got forests and they come down to the top of a high lake, right? This lake is high, there's lots of rainfall, the forests grow, and they cover the entire basin. Then you have these hyper-arid periods. This is just natural climate change for the area. It just happens like that, and the forests can't survive, so they go away. When the forests start to come back is when rainfall starts to pick up again, but now people are like, hey, this is a nice place to live after all. So they come in, and these people are different from whoever else was living there before, because these people, these groups, have learned how to use fire to control the actual vegetation around them. And so we see, like, some little representations of these little pyromaniacs, and they're chasing game. And essentially what they're doing is they're creating a situation which has never existed before, where you have high rainfall and you also have low tree cover. And that means more erosion, right? So here come all those red sediments pouring down off of the slopes of the mountains, dumping into the lake, and eventually this is the situation you have today. And then you go and you put your holes in here and you find all the artifacts, because that's where the people were living. And so they were sort of creating their own landscape, which I think is just phenomenal, to be able to find out that people 100,000 years ago were creating their own landscape. And the reason that the archaeological record exists there is because it was captured in this erosion event that they engineered or triggered. So that was a wonderful revelation, to be able to work with people who were seeing that from that side, and I got to do lots of cool stuff about it. So I put this up here in case anyone learns better with video, and I won't show it, but it's here if you want to look into it. We get to our final chapter now. The ostrich that laid the golden egg. So this is the project I'm working on now. And we'll go back to the origins of modern humans. There's a fairly well-known paper. I was fortunate to be a part of it, published in 2018, where there was this kind of proposition that we as a species are actually many other populations together. Like, we are who we are as a consequence of lots of individual populations here, 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 all kind of moving apart, becoming isolated for some time, developing their own unique cultural adaptations, their own unique biological adaptations, and then coming together, mixing, exchanging genes, exchanging ideas, moving apart, and then doing this over and over and over and over again over the last 300,000 years that we know modern humans have been around in Africa. And this is a different kind of view than, when you say, oh, modern humans arose in Africa, and people go, okay, where? Where was the spot? Where was the cradle? And they want to know, is it here? Is it here? And everyone's got their pet kind of hypothesis about why their site is the origin of all of humanity, right? This is a good selling point. But this proposition kind of changes that a little bit, because it says, no, actually, the reason humans are so unique in all of their adaptations is because of these processes of coming together, and coming together and moving apart and so on. So the relevance of this is that we would like to know what was driving that, if that was the case. And one hypothesis is that it was climate. So we've seen that climate goes in natural cycles. So as you have environmental change, maybe the spread of some type of preferred habitat, people spread, they connect, and then their habitat kind of shrinks, and so their populations shrink, and then so on and so on. So the forest belt, the Zambezian forest belt, was proposed by Cowling et al. To be maybe instrumental in a process of biogeography that later on, in our 2018 paper, we were thinking, oh yeah, that could apply to people too. So this is the kind of model that he had about forest cover in 2008. And then, as you can see, the resolution has gotten a little bit better with the models since then. And the color image was also very nice too. Now we can publish stuff in color. But one thing you'll note is that there's this thing we call an impersistent. So this model reveals, like, where are the places in Africa where it's most likely that you're going to have refugia. So like a refugium is a place where the environment doesn't change that much over time. And so all of the species that are adapted to that environment can just kind of be there. And they don't have to worry about climate change or environmental change. And you often get very high species diversity in refugia, because that's where they all kind of go to take refuge. And then the ones that are more fragile and more sensitive to environmental change are not subject to it, because their conditions locally are not changing. So at first I thought, oh, maybe Malawi's a refugium, because refugium research was really hot at that point. And I was like, I can tap into that. It's going to be a refuge. But it's not a refuge at all. It's actually kind of the opposite. The yellow here is showing you that this is a corridor of what we might think of as an impersistent ecotone. So an ecotone is where you have one type of environment and it's next to another, which means if you're an organism on this side, you can exploit resources from both, and it's advantageous for you to do that. But if your ecotone is always moving around and you're always chasing it, that has implications for who you're going to bump into when you're doing that, and how far you might end up dispersing biogeographically. If you are a mountain reedbuck, you might end up going from here to here, for example, over the long term. So it's nice to see that, this is actually kind of a corridor that would have been a place that not just sort of opened up and passively sat there waiting for species to diverse, but drew them in via these opening and closing grasslands, and then pushed them back out again, and then drew them back in and pushed them out. So it's not just, okay, forest is gone, now let's go. But actually the active, what I call the beating heart, right, of biogeographic dispersal all along from southern to eastern Africa. And that helps explain why you have these differences in populations of species that live there and there. When we get to the human part of it, it becomes even more interesting. And here's why I like ostriches, because as you can see, they do the same thing. You have ostrich to the north, you have ostrich to the south, you have no ostrich in the middle, and yet we find ostrich eggs at our sites. So I love this, because this is my favorite thing to find, and we still even have some specimens in our lab that we're still sorting through, and today I found a big piece. Pointing to you, Hannah. She's studying them. So ostrich eggs are great, because ostriches give you a lot of environmental information about things like precipitation and so on, but people also used them to make ornaments. And what we notice is that the ostriches are only there, and the ostrich ornaments are only there in the Pleistocene, so in the ice ages. The last 10,000 years, there's no ostriches at all. Instead, they make their beads out of snails. So probably the best explanation for this is the ostriches were just out of there because there's no grassland suitable to support them anymore. And as the forest belt closed in, the ostriches headed out, and people were left with no ostrich eggs to make their beads, so they just, converted to the next available type of thing, which in this case is one of those giant African land snails. Really giant. So we have these beads in our lab, and we're doing various kinds of study with them. What's cool about them is they're cultural artifacts now, so we can start to look at exchange between people. Are there similarities in how they made and used and wore beads? Locally, there are legends about hunter-gatherers who used to live there, and they actually call them the Akafula. They're described as being short, and they're described as being hunters. And there are no people there today who really self-identify as hunter-gatherers or as Akafula. So what happened to the Akafula becomes kind of a human question, and we were able to help kind of basically solve it in 2017 when we published this paper. What I'm showing you here is DNA. So every one of these bars represents a person, and then the colors represent the ancestry that appears to be most prominent in one part of, one population versus another. Meaning that if you took all the genetic diversity of every one of these bars or people and threw it into a cluster analysis and said, divide them into 10 clusters that are more similar to each other and maximize the differences that you can detect between them, that analysis would produce these colors. And basically what that's telling you is that although the majority of the human genome is identical from person to person, there's enough little bits of variation here and there that is structured geographically that you can start to see some of these differences. And what you'll notice here is that all across the eastern to the southern side, you have two main components. You have an ancient hunter-gatherer group that lived in Ethiopia, and you have an ancient hunter-gatherer group that lived in southern Africa, and they still have descendants that live there now, and they share a lot of genetic similarities. The ones in Ethiopia are not around anymore as a population that's actually self-identifying as different. So put those together, and you also have another group of hunter-gatherers that live here. These are the Central African rainforest hunter-gatherers. Some people call them pygmies. And then in Malawi today, you have people represented by this kind of green color. They look a lot like folks who come from modern Western Africa. The reason for that is because about 2,000 years ago, with the spread of agriculture, there was a huge movement of people from this part of Africa, and they went all the way down and around. And so that's why there's a lot of similarities in languages, but there's also genetic similarities in people too. And then most of the time, they admixed with the hunter-gatherers as they went, in almost every case that we know of. But in Malawi, something strange happened, and there appears to have been no admixture whatsoever. So it's what actually David Reich at Harvard calls the hardest replacement he's ever seen in his entire career, where the people who live there today look genetically nothing like the people who've been sampled who lived there in the past. And we don't know why or how that actually came about, but it was recent because they still exist in oral, in the actual oral history. People hear about them and tell stories about them. But this is the genetic composition of our ancient hunter-gatherers in Malawi. They're made up of approximately half the genomic material that's unique to this part of Africa and half of what's unique to here. And then the other, I know my math, right, that doesn't work. But, you know, it's about 40, right, 40, 20, right, with the Central African hunter-gatherers there, which is the little black bit up at the top. So this is interesting because what this tells me, going back to the ostrich, okay, I'm almost done, go to the ostrich. Remember, ostriches don't live here now today, but they did in the past, they were moving. What we're seeing here is that Malawi also was the place where people did all their mixing and their moving in the past too. It's not just, you know, an abstract mountain reedbuck or ostrich problem anymore. This is the crossroads of human population movement in Africa. So those same processes, the push and pull, were operating on human ancestors too. So zooming into Malawi, you can see that there's a number of sites here where there's ancient DNA. And I'm just showing you that these are the sites where we actually have samples, and there's what we call population structure even within them. So although the bars, as you zoom out that I just showed you, look really similar to each other, these folks don't genetically look that similar to these folks, right? They do when you compare them to like global populations, but they don't when you look at them compared to one another. Meaning that there was not a lot of marriage exchange happening even over this short distance because the genes were not flowing according to geographic distance. You know, we know that people tend to choose their mates from somewhere close by geographically, but it's like these people were living pretty locally, and they were pretty much choosing their marriage partners from local options, more so than they probably had to. That suggests that this is now the emergence of social boundaries that we're seeing. So cultural boundaries between people that are starting to, you know, kind of interfere, I suppose, with who you would perceive as a possible mate on the basis of what language you speak or what kind of clothes you wear, all of those same cultural signifiers that we have now. We can actually see that transition in this part of Africa. They were mixing and moving widely in the ice ages, and then at the end of the last ice age, they just started to differentiate culturally. So what we are now going to be able to do, what I'm showing you over here, is that these ancient hunter-gatherers, you can see there's quite a bit of dispersal here, so they're like pretty different from each other. And what we're going to do now is we're going to be able to explore that in more detail. So we're going to look at the existing DNA, and we're going to say, okay, so this group is different from that group. Culturally, what do we see in the artifacts that we recover? My very last point. Remember how I never found that site back in 2005 when I was driving around on the Nika Plateau fighting with my campmates? This is that site. So what we did was eventually I did get there. And when I went there in 2005 as a tourist, I never, ever, ever thought for a second I would actually be excavating at that site sometime in the future. Never crossed my mind, and yet here we are. So this is Fingera Cave, and it's very cold. Remember, I also mentioned it's very cold up there. And I was sitting in a conference one, 6 years ago, and someone was saying, we don't have any ancient DNA from Africa because it's so hot there. And I was like, hang on, Africa's a pretty diverse place. And I remember being very cold. And then I also remembered that there was a site that Desmond Clark and his student had excavated in the 60s, and that it was Fingera Cave, and that it was cold up there. And it all kind of put together in my head, and I thought, I have to get to that site. That's going to be where we're going to find ancient DNA. It's actually going to be preserved. And this was back when nothing had been published from ancient DNA in Africa at all. So I was very excited about this. And together with some folks from the Department of Museums and Monuments in Malawi, we went up there, and the site is in shocking condition. The hole was left open by the archaeologists who dug there. And then, because it's so remote and hard to get to, and the roads are so bad, it's mostly used as a poacher's camp today. So there's human bones coming out of the walls and scattered around and being stood on. And when we arrived, there was a big rock with just human bones all over it. And this is hard to mitigate because as soon as you start to fill the hole and pack it in properly with sandbags and do that, someone comes along who's not supposed to be there and says, oh, this looks interesting. I wonder what they're hiding here. And then they dig it out and they do even more damage. So at the moment, it's just kind of left like that. And I worry that every single tourist who goes through there and manages to find it is going to take home a souvenir. So this is very stressful to me, thinking about kind of the long-term fate of some of these sites and our ability to actually preserve them for the future. Finding the old actual hole was a little bit complicated. This was actually when we went back in 2022, because now what we're doing is we've gone to the same site to look for sediment DNA. So this is Dr. Diendo Masalani. He's a new hire in the Department of Genetics here at Yale, and he's gonna look for DNA in the sediment, which means more ancient DNA that doesn't require actually destroying human bone. Right. So the final kind of piece here is, where did this all come from? I'm following the breadcrumbs of J. Desmond Clark this whole trip. Everywhere I went, it was like he'd been there before somehow. And I really wanted to find a new site that he hadn't already excavated at somehow. And it just seemed so unlikely that he would find the only great site around. But in this case, he did find an amazing one. This is a rock shelter called Hora. That's an archive photo from 1950. And as you can see, we relocated it now. The open woodland has encroached. And I just want to warn you that the next slide doesn't have photos of human bones, but it's got some drawings. So just be ready for that. This is the site, and we did our own excavation there. And Clark had excavated there in 1950, and he found 2 human burials, here and here. And it took us a very long time to figure out where he had found them, because there's no maps or markers or old holes or anything. But we've eventually worked it out. And what we found was a giant mound of ash, a huge mound of ash. And in it are the remains of a single adult woman dating to 9,500 years ago. And when I first wanted to start this project, I put in a proposal, and it had all these hypotheses about the ice ages and so on. And all the reviewers said, it's not gonna be that old. The site is not gonna be any older than 4,000 or 5,000 years, if you're lucky. Well, it turns out when we got direct ages and DNA from both the woman and the man that Clark had found, you can see that one is 9,000 years old and one is 8,000 years old. And then we just kept digging deeper, and we found 2 more burials. One of them is 16,000 years old. And all of them have ancient DNA, except for the cremation. Because when you burn bone, it is not good for DNA preservation. So there's this phenomenal record of ancient DNA of populations at the same exact site. Really, really unexpected and really gratifying to have that come to light. And then we can look at their environments and their interactions and the beads and the ostriches and the breed bucks and all of the things that we want to know about change over time. And furthermore, it's probably the oldest cremation anywhere in Africa that has been published so far. So we're working on that. And this is what we can kind of imagine happening when you go to a site late at night. It's not the same place. In the day it's noisy, people are digging. But when you go there at night, you can really imagine what it was like there. Especially, you can see this black spot, and I don't know. I mean, part of me wonders, is that soot from the cremation 9,000 years ago? Can that happen? We know you get preservation that good in Europe, but that's in deeper caves. I mean, it's tempting. You can see it's still there in our photos. So it's a remarkable experience to be able to do this. Now what we're doing is I finally did find another site that Clark had not yet found. This is called Mazinga. We have been digging there for a few years, and we'll do our last field season there in a couple of months. It goes older than 30,000 years, so we keep going back in time. And finally, we're going to be able to link up with the Middle Stone Age. And if you want to, you can check out this video where we kind of show you where we are working there. You can see our team and then the landscape. But the kind of the last piece to this is the story part. The bit where they said, it's not going to be old, the bit where they said, you'll never get DNA, all of those bits and pieces, it finally came together, and it came together last year in this wonderful paper that we were able to co-write with a number of other people, and it was named one of the top 10 most read NSF research stories of the year. And, this is across all of science, not just like my tiny little piece of it. So that was wonderful. However, it was also hilarious because NSF never actually funded any of it. They just kept saying no. But now they have agreed to fund the next 3 years. So we will be excavating here again this summer, and then we're going to shift to the south of Malawi, and we're going to start building out that chronology so that we have dates that are as good for that part of the country as we've been able to work out for the north. And then we'll be able to look at the population structure here and here and actually see what these folks were doing culturally. I promised you there would be a moral at the end of this story. So I think my audience is of an age where you will understand. This isn't really a fairy tale moral, but it works, right? I kept having this in my head, like, just keep trying. People will get interested. Just keep at it. Just keep at it. And I think we've had some success with that. And as you can see, it's a beautiful place. So I'm very happy to be able to work there. There's other possible morals that are maybe a little bit more do unto others, right? We know where this is going. I want to point out that Malawi is the only country in Africa that doesn't have a national museum, which I feel acutely as somebody who's now working so actively with museums. And so this is kind of the state of their collection. And this is an open window with no glass, by the way. And there's no roof. I mean, there's a roof, but it's full of bees. So what we did is last year, we said, okay, you know what? I mean, at the very least, we can properly curate the stuff that we've been able to excavate and help build some shelves. So we went there and we built a bunch of shelves and we put some cabinets in and we try to put stuff away in these more durable boxes. But there's a long road ahead. And this is where, you know, everything goes in the end. The human remains, all of the beads, all of the artifacts. I'm very lucky to be able to temporarily export them for study, but you know, they all go home in the next year or two. And this is where they will eventually end up. So I just want to kind of point out that doing exciting and interesting research in exciting and interesting places is hard. It's hard because like the wet season isn't convenient. It's hard because the rocks are too, you know, paving, getting in your way. It's hard because the road makes it too hard to find the site. It's hard because when you do find stuff, you can't store it in a very good set of conditions. So just kind of behind the scenes of all this excitement and all this adventure, just remember all of the hard work that all the people put into it, including this group from last year. So this was our team last year. Hopefully a lot of them will be back again this year. And I forgot my acknowledgement slide is actually earlier. So thank you very much for sitting and listening to all of that and letting me take you on that journey.
Thanks, Jess. I'm sure Jessica would be happy to take a couple of questions. And we have microphones on either side.
Yeah.
So you're about to be microphoned.
Oh, I can speak. Oh, great. Can one infer from your talk that human evolution took place by a mixing of humanoids throughout Africa, similar to the ostrich example you used?
Yeah, it depends on where you want to start the human question. You know, if you want
Yeah, well, at what time were things human? But
the oldest skeletal remains of modern humans in Africa are actually from North Africa, and they date to 300,000 years ago. But then there's some close seconds in Ethiopia that are about 230,000 years old, and then there's another one in South Africa that's 160,000 years old. So you sort of put it together, and it's like, we don't have enough fossils to be able to say for sure. But certainly, they must have been connected in this way, because at the end of the day, we are here.
yes, through accidents of weather and climate and so on. So it's and now we've stopped because we've got control of the environment. And so anyway, so the mixing created what we are.
I mean, it's a hypothesis, and I think we found evidence for it that supports it, which was kind of nice because the hypothesis existed before we ever knew that DNA evidence would be possible to get. And it does seem to support that there was incredibly widespread human physical interaction, because that's how genes spread. And then you don't see it so much in the last 10,000 years. People get really local in where they want to, how far they want to go to find their marriage partner. So what's causing that is an open question. And actually, that's what we want to test. Is it the environment? So it's like, my resources are, found in this little patch. So therefore, I'm not going to walk outside my patch. And I'm not going to meet anybody if I do that. Or is it more, yeah, my resources are over there, but there's like these other people over there, and I don't want to interact with them. So is it a social boundary or is it an environmental boundary? That's what we want to find out.
But if the environment changes, then that gives them impetus to
Potentially,
to
yeah.
move.
Potentially, exactly. So then it's like, is this something that kind of came within early modern humans? Or I should say at the end of kind of the, you know, we already just and we're all over the place at that point. But it's a phenomenon that is, you know, it feels familiar. It's kind of like we know humans rely so much on cultural identity. And at what point did that really kick into being crucial to our social interactions? Was it recent or was it very deep in time?
Thank you.
So I think we got another question up here.
You mentioned you mentioned fossils several times. It's been a long time since I worked in Malawi, but my focus was really gems and minerals. But I remember in going through the geologic maps, there were large areas that were marked as fossil fields. Is there any work going on relative to that? I asked the chairman of the Geologic Survey, and they have a local museum at the Geologic Survey in Zomba, and they pulled out crates, actually, that had dinosaur fossils.
Yeah, yeah, they have a lot of interesting sedimentary sequences there.
Are there things going on?
So it's like, what that means is there's always uplift and tectonic action like this. And so it means that you have sediments burying dead things and creating fossils, and then you have them exposing them through erosion, and then you find the fossils. So it's always that push and pull. And you're right, in northern Malawi, there's incredible potential. There's fossils of what some people call mammal-like reptiles, but apparently stem amnio is more appropriate. Anyway, basically older than dinosaurs. Then there's a whole sedimentary sequence with dinosaurs. There's even something called Malawisaurus, which is from there. It's Jurassic. And then you have early hominins, potentially even Australopiths going back 4 million years, but no one's even explored those deposits. And then going all the way up through Homo erectus, that's the middle Pleistocene. That's that hand axe that I showed you that nobody had ever reported that being there. That time period is there. It just isn't being investigated. So I'm trying to reach out to anyone who is interested in any of these time periods and saying, hey, let's look at this really long-term biogeography here. Not something I have to lead, but maybe I can facilitate. You know, maybe I can introduce them to local collaborators. Maybe I can show them the lay of the land. And we can start to develop that really vibrant research culture that I see my colleagues and envy my colleagues having when they work in like Ethiopia or Kenya, and they all show up at the Kenya National Museum, and they connect with so many different issues and people there. And there's nothing like that in Malawi because of its particular history, its lack of a museum, but the potential is there. So that's sort of my long-term vision, maybe chapter 10. We'll get there.
I think we have another question up here.
Hi, Jess. Thanks for such a great talk. I know that there's been some recent success in extracting proteomes from ostrich eggshell. Is that anything that you guys have tried or had any success with?
Yeah, we're dancing around the edges of it. It's just like what information you get from it is a little more limited. So we are working with Beatrice DeMarchi, who did that work in Laetoli, and she's got proteomes. So these are like ancient proteins from ostrich eggs that are 4 million years old. From an even more arid place. And then there are ostrich eggs in the 2.5 to 4 million year old deposits. And we're working with some folks who are trying to maybe even date them using one of these new methods. But everything is new. You know, all the dating methods that we're trying there are new. Not radiocarbon, because that's more, you know, the recent stuff. But for the older material, it's been really, really hard to date. And so we're kind of in the experimental phase of trying to figure out how to get a better age on those deposits. Like, how old is this early Homo anyway? It could be many different ages. And then the implications of where it fits in our family tree differ depending on how old it is.
Well, let's do one more question. Mr. McHenry here.
When you showed one of your, thank you, fantastic talk. When you showed one of your first slides about where we have fossil sites in Africa, there were big swaths of Africa where there were no fossil sites. It seemed to correlate with what's today humid tropical forests, and I wonder if that was the relationship, or we just haven't found them yet.
They correlate with humid tropical forests and with conflict zones. So, you know, you have a lack of fossils mostly in the kinds of environments that you just described. They don't fossilize very well in these deep forests where there have been long, persistent forests. But you also, because to get a fossil, you have to have lots of erosion and you have to have sediment burying it. You can sort of get that in some key places, but it's not that likely. But out in the Sahara, there's plenty of exciting fossil work there. There's just a lot of roving bands of, you know, Boko Haram and stuff as well. So there's a lot of potential that's untapped for that reason. That's one reason I love working in Malawi, is you will not get abducted in Malawi. I mean, it is a consideration. That's why I've been able to take so many students there. It's a great place to work. People are friendly. It's just infrastructure is still challenging.
Is the language English?
Actually, it is one of the official languages is English. The other one's Chichewa. And then there's a variety of other local languages that are spoken.
Let's thank Jess again.
Thank you.